You know that feeling, right? Like you're trying to get a handle on some huge, rapidly moving topic, and every direction you turn, there's just more information. It feels like standing under a fire hose.
Oh, absolutely. Information overload.
And if you've been trying to understand the world of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, particularly when it comes to what companies are disclosing, well, you've probably felt that fire hose effect lately.
Yeah.
It's constantly changing, it's incredibly complex, and honestly, staying on top of it feels like a monumental task.
It absolutely does. You've got regulation shifting all the time. Stakeholder expectations are climbing. New technologies are adding layers. It's just a moving target.
Right.
And cutting through all that noise is essential if you want to figure out what's actually happening on the ground.
And that's exactly our mission today. We're doing a deep dive, and we're using a fantastic source, the 2025 ESG white paper from the China Europe International Business School, CEIBS.
A really solid piece of work.
It is. This paper isn't just some dry report. It's a genuinely insightful analysis that cuts through a lot of that complexity. It really maps out this profound paradigm shift in how companies are approaching sustainability disclosure and communication.
It highlights that this whole conversation is moving way beyond just, filing reports. The white paper makes a really compelling case that ESG communication is becoming strategic, it's value creating,
Value creating, yeah.
and increasingly what they call a language without borders. It's fundamentally transforming into a cornerstone for long-term business value.
A language without borders. I really like that phrase. It captures that idea perfectly, doesn't it? That this isn't just some domestic bureaucracy. It's about enabling a global dialogue on shared challenges.
Precisely.
And the paper really gets into the nitty-gritty of how this global language is evolving, and importantly, it draws from real-world examples.
It does. We'll be unpacking the global convergence we're seeing in ESG policies, definitely. But we'll also look at some really striking differences, especially when you compare the historical approaches and, the current dynamics in places like the US and Europe.
Yeah, those contrasts are fascinating.
And we'll take a specific look at China, too. The paper describes China as having a particularly rapid and, frankly, unique journey in this space. It's driven by its own set of policy and market forces.
And critically, as you mentioned, we're going to bring this to life with specific company examples cited right there in the paper. We'll see how businesses are moving from just ticking reporting boxes to genuinely integrating ESG into their strategy.
And communicating that strategically, which is key.
Exactly.
We'll also touch on the persistent challenges companies face, because it's not all smooth sailing, obviously. And we'll peer into the future a bit, exploring how things like technology and evolving stakeholder expectations are shaping what comes next.
So, consider this your shortcut to understanding the 2025 ESG disclosure landscape, straight from an insightful source. We're going to go, point by point through the key takeaways from the CEIBS white paper, giving you a comprehensive picture. Let's unpack this.
Okay, let's dive in.
Okay, so the paper starts by giving us some essential historical context. It shows that ESG disclosure wasn't always the, standardized, widespread practice we see emerging today. It takes us back to a time when things looked quite different across the globe.
That's right. If you rewind to, say, the 1990s and even into the early 2010s, the approaches to disclosing environmental, social, and governance info were highly fragmented.
Right.
There just wasn't a unified global understanding or a widespread push for standardized reporting everywhere.
And the paper identifies some distinct early approaches in key economic areas. Let's start across the Atlantic in the U.S. What was the story there?
Well, in the United States, the historical context is heavily shaped by this focus on shareholder value maximization.
The classic Friedman doctrine, basically.
Pretty much. This principle, deeply embedded in corporate law and culture, meant that companies primarily prioritized disclosing information that was directly relevant to financial performance. Things like earnings reports, profitability metrics.
Yeah.
That was the main game.
And social and environmental stuff.
Generally less emphasized. It was seen more as optional, nice to have, but not core compared to the hard financial numbers.
And I imagine there was some resistance when the idea of mandatory ESG rules first popped up.
Absolutely. The paper notes significant resistance. Often it was framed in terms of the increased costs and the administrative burdens it would place on businesses.
The usual arguments.
Yeah. And there was also this philosophical viewpoint that these non-financial issues weren't really core to a company's business purpose. So the argument went, they shouldn't be subject to the same kind of mandated reporting as financial data.
That philosophical difference, shareholders first versus broader responsibility, seems like a key thread here.
It's a really key thread throughout the paper, yes. It explains a lot of the divergence we still see.
Okay, so U.S. focused on shareholders, less emphasis on environment, social, wary of mandates. How did Europe approach things during this early period? Was it different?
Oh, very different. Europe, especially countries like those in the Nordics, had a different tradition. It was rooted more in a social contract philosophy.
Social contract. How so?
Well, companies were seen as having broader responsibilities, not just to shareholders, but also to society, to the environment, to their employees. Multiple stakeholders.
Right.
This view positioned corporate social responsibility, or CSR, as much more central to a company's purpose, not just an add-on.
So ESG or CSR back then was kind of baked into the idea of being a responsible corporate citizen.
Exactly. And this led to earlier movements in Europe towards integrating environmental and social considerations into business strategy and naturally pushing for disclosure on those things. The EU itself began introducing some early directives related to sustainable finance.
But was this early European push very influential globally at first?
The paper points out that initially, the influence was somewhat limited. It primarily impacted the large multinational companies operating within those specific European markets. It wasn't yet a global standard setter.
Got it. And what about Asia during this time, places like Japan and China?
In Asia, during this early phase, ESG disclosure was far less developed. It was largely voluntary, pretty inconsistent, and it lacked strong government or regulatory guidance.
So companies might do some things, but no structured reporting.
Right. You might see some basic philanthropy or some environmental efforts, but structured, comprehensive ESG reporting just wasn't a common practice or expectation yet.
Okay, so we had these distinct silos. U.S. prioritizing financial shareholder value, Europe integrating CSR with a social contract view, and Asia just beginning with mostly voluntary stuff.
Yeah.
What triggered the shift? What started pushing these different approaches toward convergence?
Well, the paper highlights a crucial turning point around 2010. That decade saw a really significant increase in global awareness and concern about major challenges like climate change, social inequality.
These became front-page news, really.
Exactly. This rising global agenda started pushing these ESG issues from being optional or niche towards becoming a more central global objective for policy and for business.
And the paper singles out one specific event that really helped solidify this move towards a shared global goal, didn't it?
Yes, the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. That's identified as particularly pivotal.
Why was Paris so important for disclosure?
Because this international agreement didn't just set emissions targets. By establishing common global goals for tackling climate change, it created a powerful shared objective. And this shared purpose then acted as a significant driver for policy coordination among nations regarding environmental protection, sustainable development.
Which in turn demanded a way for companies to report on their contribution, or lack thereof.
Precisely. The Paris Agreement essentially created a common language for the problem, which then spurred the need for a common language for companies to report their part in the solution. It provided that common reference point and really galvanized governments worldwide to start thinking seriously about relevant legislation and standardization frameworks for corporate reporting on these global challenges.
That makes perfect sense. You need a way to measure collective progress towards those shared goals. Okay, so since 2015, we've seen this significant global regulatory push, right?
We absolutely have. And the paper notes that the EU has really been at the forefront of this.
Leading the charge.
Yes, definitely. We saw regulations like the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, which is all about how financial market participants disclose sustainability risks and impacts that came into effect in 2021.
Right. SFDR focused on the finance sector.
And then came the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, adopted in late 2022.
Now, what makes the CSRD such a significant step? Why is it such a big deal?
The CSRD is huge, primarily because it dramatically expands the number of companies in the EU required to report on sustainability. We're talking thousands more companies, including large non-EU companies that operate there.
So the scope just ballooned.
Exactly. And crucially, it also mandates much more detailed and standardized disclosure compared to any previous rules. It requires companies to report according to specific European Sustainable Reporting Standards, or ESRS,
ESRS.
developed by EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. These standards aim to ensure really systematic and transparent information across environmental, social, and governance areas. It's comprehensive.
Okay, so the EU is mandating comprehensive, standardized reporting, pushing hard. How has the U.S. been responding? The paper mentions the SEC.
Right. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which oversees listed companies over there, they did propose stricter climate disclosure rules back in 2022.
What would those rules require?
These draft rules would require public companies to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, including Scope 1 and 2, their direct emissions, and in some cases Scope 3, the indirect ones from the value chain.
Scope 3 is the tricky one.
Always. And they'd also have to report on climate-related risks and the potential financial impacts of those risks. The paper sees this move by the SEC as a signal, sort of the U.S. catching up to the EU in terms of regulatory direction anyway. It points towards potentially more mandatory climate reporting in the U.S. market.
But as you hinted earlier, the picture in the U.S. is complicated, isn't it? The paper immediately contrasts this SEC move with a strong counter-movement.
That's the really interesting tension the paper highlights, yes. Despite the SEC's proposed rules, the U.S. has also experienced a significant and, frankly, very vocal anti-ESG movement.
Politically charged.
Very much so. This pushback has gained considerable political momentum, particularly from figures associated with the previous administration. Many Republican-led states have actually enacted legislation aimed at restricting the consideration of non-financial factors like ESG in investment decisions, especially for state pension funds.
Wow. And the paper even tries to quantify the impact of this anti-ESG stance on the market.
It does. It notes that this policy and political backdrop has coincided with pretty substantial outflows from ESG-labeled investment funds in the U.S. Since late 2022, the market has seen something like $26 billion withdrawn from these funds.
26 billion, that's significant.
It is. And over 80 funds have actually removed ESG from their names or their investment objectives. So this shows the real-world financial impact of that philosophical and political resistance playing out in the U.S. market.
So it circles right back to that fundamental philosophical difference you mentioned earlier, the U.S. free market shareholder-first focus versus the European social contract idea?
The paper strongly argues that this difference underlies the divergence we're seeing. The U.S. anti-ESG stance, with its emphasis on shareholder primacy and minimal interference, aligns perfectly with that free market philosophy. European regulatory acceleration, on the other hand, stems clearly from the social contract view that companies have responsibilities to a broader set of stakeholders. This difference in corporate philosophy helps explain why, even as regulations might seem to move in a similar direction globally towards more disclosure, the actual pace, the scope, and the level of political acceptance differ so dramatically between these two major regions.
It's a fascinating dynamic. Okay, so while Europe is pushing hard and the U.S. is caught in this regulatory political tension, how are other regions, particularly in Asia, positioned? The paper suggests they're moving forward despite the U.S. situation.
Yes, the paper emphasizes that many other significant markets are actively exploring or implementing mandatory or semi-mandatory ESG disclosure. They aren't waiting for the U.S. debate to resolve.
Like where?
Well, in Japan, for instance, the Financial Services Agency, the FSA, now requires companies listed on the top tier of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the prime market, to reference the recommendations of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, in their reports.
TCFD is becoming quite influential globally.
Very much so. And in China and Hong Kong, the exchanges there are also developing their own specific guidelines.
Yes. Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing, HKEX, as well as the Shanghai Stock Exchange, SSE, and Shenzhen Stock Exchange, SCSE. In mainland China, they've all been progressively issuing their own ESG guidelines and amending their listing rules. This is compelling more and more companies in these major Asian markets to integrate environmental and social issues into their compliance management and their external communication. So while the U.S. debate is definitely notable, the broader global trend towards increased ESG disclosure and integration is clearly continuing in many other key markets.
It really seems like the global direction of travel is towards more reporting, more standardization, even with these regional variations.
Definitely. But even with these converging trends, there's still this space between what's strictly mandatory and what's voluntary, right? The paper points out that this creates a challenge, the potential for selective disclosure.
That's a critical challenge highlighted by the paper, absolutely. Even as mandatory rules expand, companies often still have discretion, particularly in areas where reporting is still voluntary or where the metrics aren't yet fully standardized across the board. And this gap can lead to what the paper terms selective disclosure.
And what's the big risk with selective disclosure? What's the problem?
Well, the risk is that companies might present an incomplete or, frankly, biased picture of their performance, essentially adopting a strategy of report only the good news, ignore the risks.
Cherry picking the data.
Exactly. They might prominently feature their positive environmental initiatives or maybe their social programs, but conveniently omit information about significant environmental risks they face, or negative social impacts from their operations, or maybe areas where they're falling short of their own targets.
And that makes it hard for investors and the public to get a real picture.
Very difficult.
Hmm.
It prevents a genuinely balanced and accurate view of the company's overall sustainability profile.
This sounds exactly like the problem of greenwashing.
It is. Selective disclosure is a key enabler of greenwashing, where a company attempts to appear more environmentally or socially responsible than it actually is.
And regulators are aware of this.
Oh, yes. The paper notes that regulators are increasingly aware of this issue. And to combat it, to push for more credible reporting, they're doing a couple of things. They're strengthening their review processes for the disclosed information itself. And importantly, they're increasingly requiring or strongly recommending third-party assurance, external verification of the reported ESG data.
Ah, so getting independent eyes on the number.
Precisely. The trend is not just towards more reporting, but towards reporting that is verifiable and therefore more trustworthy. The focus is shifting from simply providing information to ensuring the accuracy, completeness, and reliability of that information, often through independent validation.
Okay, that provides a great overview of the global landscape and that regulatory push. Now, let's shift gears slightly and move into the core value proposition of ESG disclosure. The paper argues its value is evolving well beyond just meeting compliance requirements. The first key aspect it emphasizes is the communication value. How are these standardized frameworks helping to build that language without borders we talked about earlier?
Right. This is where those converging standards and frameworks become incredibly powerful communication tools. They are essentially building a common vocabulary and a standardized grammar for companies to talk about their environmental, social, and governance performance.
Like a universal ESG dictionary.
In a way, yes. This allows the information to be understood and, crucially, compared across different cultures, industries, and national borders. It breaks down some of those communication barriers.
Let's look at some specific frameworks the paper discusses and how they act as these communication tools. GRI is mentioned as one of the earliest, most foundational ones.
Yes, the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI. The paper describes it as one of the foundational frameworks. It sees GRI as providing that basic dictionary. You mentioned a wide range of metrics and indicators covering environmental, social, and governance issues.
And its value comes from being widely used.
Exactly. Because it's so widely adopted globally, it gives stakeholders, whether they're investors, NGOs, employees, or the public in different parts of the world, a common set of terms to understand and evaluate a company's performance. It enables that cross-cultural understanding and comparison.
Okay, GRI is the broad dictionary. How does SSB fit into this language? Is it different?
SSB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, has a slightly different, more focused role. While GRI is broad, SSB standards are tailored for 77 specific industries.
Industry specific, okay.
The paper describes SB as providing an industry-specific language. Its value lies in focusing on sustainability information that is considered financially material.
Financially material meaning likely to affect the bottom line for companies in that sector.
Precisely. Information that's reasonably likely to affect the financial condition or operating performance of companies in that specific industry. This makes it particularly useful for investors who are looking to understand sector-specific ESG risks and opportunities and compare companies within the same industry based on metrics that are genuinely relevant to their financial analysis.
Got it. So GRI is the universal dictionary. SAFB is the specialized industry handbook for investors. What about TCFD? It focuses just on climate, right?
Yes, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, specifically addresses climate change. The paper highlights its structure around 4 core pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets.
And how does that structure facilitate communication on such a complex topic like climate?
By providing this consistent framework, TCFD allows companies to present information on things like their carbon emissions, their climate risks, their adaptation strategies, all in a structured, comparable way. It helps translate complex climate science and policy issues into business terms that investors and other financial stakeholders can actually understand and use.
So it enables a more effective dialogue specifically about a company's climate resilience and its impact on climate.
Exactly. It allows for a better comparison of strategies and governance approaches related to climate across different companies.
And then the paper calls the ISSB the most significant development in the space recently. Why is ISSB seen as such a big deal?
Absolutely. The International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, it was created by the IFRS Foundation, which oversees international accounting standards. They released their first two standards in 2023. IFRS S1 for general sustainability-related disclosures, and IFRS S2 specifically for climate-related disclosures.
And the paper positions these as creating a unified ESG communication coordinate system. What does that mean?
It means the ISSB's explicit goal is to create a global baseline of sustainability standards. The aim is to lead to globally comparable information that investors can rely on. It's built on the assets of the Value Reporting Foundation, which actually included SSB.
So it's integrating previous efforts.
Yes, and it works closely with GRI and TCFD, aiming to integrate and build upon these existing frameworks, not replace them entirely, but create a common foundation.
And the benefit of this unified system.
The paper argues that this unified system significantly reduces friction for multinational corporations that have to report across different countries, and it helps international investors trying to compare companies globally. It provides a clearer, globally recognized framework for communication and cooperation.
Which is particularly valuable for companies trying to operate internationally.
Very much so, including, the paper notes, for Chinese companies looking to go global and engage effectively with international capital markets. It helps them speak that global language.
Okay, so these frameworks are building the infrastructure for global ESG communication. But the paper also makes a really crucial distinction that disclosure alone isn't the point. It also has management value. But it's careful to state that disclosure itself doesn't automatically improve the bottom line. Can you unpack that?
Yes, that's a critical clarification the paper makes. It cites research, like a big review study by Tenzi Whelan and others that looked at over 1,000 studies between 2015 and 2020.
And what did that review find?
It found that simply producing an ESG report or disclosing data doesn't automatically translate into improved financial performance or higher stock returns. Disclosure in itself is essentially just reporting information. It's information transfer.
So the act of disclosure isn't the magic bullet for value creation?
No. The paper emphasizes that the real value comes from companies actually integrating ESG principles and practices into their core business operations, into their strategic planning, into their day-to-day decision-making.
It's the underlying actions that matter.
Exactly. It's the actions that result from paying attention to ESG issues.
Yeah.
Things like improving operational efficiency, developing more sustainable products and services, attracting mission-aligned talent, better managing risks, appealing to investors and consumers who prioritize sustainability, optimizing supply chains. Those are the things that drive long-term competitiveness and financial growth.
And the disclosure then becomes the way to show what you're doing.
Precisely. The disclosure then becomes the necessary mechanism for demonstrating the impact of these underlying actions and showing how the company is creating value through its ESG integration.
And the paper uses the COVID-19 pandemic as a really striking example of this linkage between integration and actual performance, doesn't it?
Yes, that's a powerful point drawn from that Whelan study. It found that companies that demonstrated stronger resilience and better performance during the initial shock of the COVID-19 crisis, meaning better stock returns, for example, were often the same companies that had higher ESG scores going into the crisis.
Particularly in certain areas.
Particularly in areas like human capital management, supply chain resilience, and how quickly they could adapt their products or services. This suggests that companies which had already integrated robust ESG practices into their operations were inherently better prepared to navigate that massive disruption and perform well under pressure.
So value isn't in the report as some standalone document, but in the real operational changes and the strategic thinking that the disclosure process encourages, and then, importantly, makes visible to the outside world.
Exactly that. The paper really reinforces that for ESG to truly generate value, companies need to do more than just compile data for a report once a year. They must embed ESG into their core strategy. They need to establish mechanisms to measure and evaluate progress towards their ESG goals. They need to regularly disclose their actual performance and improvement over time, not just a glossy snapshot.
And engage with people.
And engage in meaningful dialogue with their stakeholders, investors, employees, communities, customers.
So this integrated approach, embedding in strategy, measuring performance, disclosing real progress, and engaging, that's what builds genuine transparency, enhances reputation, strengthens competitiveness, and ultimately underpins sustained financial performance and value creation.
Precisely. Disclosure acts as an engine driving continuous improvement, but only when it reflects genuine action and integration within the company.
Got it. Okay, we've covered the global landscape, the regulatory pushes, and this evolving value of ESG disclosure. Now, let's zoom in on a market that the paper describes as undergoing particularly rapid transformation: China. The paper details China's unique ESG disclosure journey, driven by a combination of policy and market demand. It calls it multi-party promotion, accelerating standardization. What does that dual driver mean in practice?
The paper identifies two major forces really propelling ESG disclosure forward in China. First, there's a very strong top-down regulatory push. Government bodies, regulators, they are actively issuing policies, guidelines, setting requirements, particularly for listed companies and the large state-owned enterprises, the SOEs.
Positioning them as leaders.
Yes, positioning them as leaders and examples in ESG practice and disclosure.
Okay, that's the top-down push. What's the other driver? Is it market-driven?
Yes. The second driver is growing market demand, both domestically and internationally. Investors, asset managers, consumers, even the broader international community, they're all increasingly demanding more transparency from Chinese companies on their sustainability performance and their social responsibility.
Especially as China plays a bigger role globally.
Absolutely. As global capital markets pay closer attention to ESG factors in investment decisions, Chinese companies are feeling compelled to improve their disclosure quality simply to remain competitive and participate effectively in those global dialogues.
So, push from the top, pull from the market. The paper walks us through China's policy evolution in 5 distinct stages. Let's go through them quickly to see this progression. What characterized the first stage, the preliminary exploration phase, back in the mid-2000s?
Right, the first stage, roughly 2006 to 2009, was indeed about preliminary exploration. It really began with revisions to China's company law and securities law in 2006. Now, the term ESG wasn't widely used then, but these revisions introduced the concept of social responsibility into the legal framework for listed companies' governance. It was a starting point.
Were there any early moves specifically on disclosure back then?
Yes, the Shanghai Stock Exchange, the SSE, took a significant early step in 2008. They issued guiding opinions specifically on environmental information disclosure.
That seems quite early.
It was. This was a key starting point, encouraging listed companies to begin disclosing information related to things like environmental protection investments, pollutant emissions, energy-saving achievements. It marked that initial formal recognition within China's capital market that environmental issues needed to be reported.
Okay, so the legal concept of social responsibility introduced and early environmental guidance from the SSE. What happened in the second stage, roughly 2010 to 2015? Did things pick up?
The second stage, 2010-2015, saw the institutional framework gradually taking shape. During this period, corporate social responsibility reports, CSR reports, became more common among listed companies.
Was this mandatory yet?
No, not really. Many began voluntarily, or maybe in response to sort of soft encouragement from regulators or industry associations, to publish these CSR reports. They'd cover areas like environmental protection, public welfare, employee relations.
Was there more government focus during this time as well?
Yes, definitely. During this period, government documents and national plans began explicitly advocating for concepts like green development and sustainable development. This encouraged companies to include environmental and energy conservation information in their public reporting.
So laying the groundwork.
Exactly. While nationwide mandatory requirements were still largely absent, the explorations and practices emerging at the local and industry levels provided practical experience that laid the groundwork for a more structured system later on.
Okay, so more CSR reports, government advocacy, but still mostly voluntary or encouraged. What shifted in the third stage, 2016-2018, that moved things towards being semi-mandatory?
In the third stage, 2016 to 2018, there was a noticeable shift from pure advocacy towards what the paper calls a semi-mandatory approach. A major catalyst here was the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
Hong Kong's influence.
Yes. HKEX introduced new mandatory ESG reporting rules in 2016. These were higher requirements. They applied to companies listed on both mainland China and Hong Kong exchanges, the so-called A+H shares. This naturally drew significant attention and started influencing practices within the mainland market itself.
And the mainland exchanges, SSE and SESE, started tightening their own rules in response.
Precisely. Between 2017 and 2018, both the Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchanges revised their information disclosure rules for listed companies and their self-regulatory guidelines. These revisions significantly strengthened the requirements for disclosing environmental and social responsibility information.
What was the impact?
This regulatory pressure led to a higher number of companies incorporating ESG matters into their annual reports or publishing separate social responsibility reports. And generally, the depth and scope of the disclosure started to increase.
Okay, so HKX influenced SESEC following suit with tighter rules, moving towards semi-mandatory. What was key about the fourth stage, 2019-2020? Strengthening regulation and policy synergy?
Yes, the fourth stage, 2019-2020, was characterized by strengthened regulation and policy synergy. In 2019, revisions to the guidelines on corporate governance for listed companies provided clearer expectations. They explicitly linked good governance with fulfilling social responsibility and improving environmental governance.
Making that connection stronger.
Exactly, drawing a stronger link between corporate governance structures and these broader ESG concepts.
And more specific guidelines started appearing around this time, too.
Yes. This period saw a real proliferation of guidelines from various industry associations and local governments, all aimed at compiling ESG or CSR reports. This contributed to a more multi-layered and standardized approach to disclosure starting to emerge.
And something big happened in 2020.
Critically, yes. 2020 was the year China announced its ambitious dual carbon goals, aiming for carbon peaking before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060.
Huge national strategy.
Absolutely. And this national strategy immediately spurred a whole raft of green finance policies.
How did green finance policies specifically impact the ESG disclosure landscape? What was the connection?
These policies brought environmental and social factors directly into the realm of financial risk management and investment decisions. Banks, insurance companies, asset managers, they were required to pay much closer attention to the environmental and social risks associated with their lending and investments.
So they had to ask companies for this data.
Yes, and they had to incorporate these factors into their own risk management frameworks and disclosure systems. This created a really powerful link, embedding sustainability considerations right into the core of the financial system.
That does sound like a fundamental shift. Okay, which brings us to the fifth and current stage, from 2021 to the present. The paper calls this moving towards comprehensive mandatory disclosure and standardization. What defines this stage?
This is the stage of really accelerating towards more comprehensive mandatory disclosure and much greater standardization. Starting in 2021, those dual carbon goals were formally written into the government work report, signaling their paramount national importance.
Making it official policy priority number one?
Pretty much. Following this, capital market regulators, particularly the CSRC and the exchanges, significantly improved listing rules and industry guidelines. They made it mandatory for certain listed companies to comprehensively disclose environmental, social, and governance information.
Not just encouraged anymore.
No. And this disclosure must now appear either in their annual reports, their semi-annual reports, or in dedicated sustainable development reports.
And the paper specifically highlights the role of SASAC here, especially for the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs. What did SASAC do?
Yes, SASAC, the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, which oversees China's large SOEs, has played a really critical role. They mandated that eligible central SOEs must publish Sustainable Development or ESG reports, no longer optional for them.
And they linked it to performance.
And significantly, yes, they linked the quality and the completion of this reporting directly to the SOE's performance assessment.
Linking ESG reporting to executive performance evaluations, that's always a powerful incentive, isn't it?
It's a very strong signal, yes. Furthermore, from 2022 onwards, regulators have been actively promoting the establishment of unified ESG disclosure standards specifically for China's capital market, often referencing international frameworks like the ISSB standards we discussed.
Aiming for alignment.
Right. And they are also progressively integrating ESG considerations into the actual decision-making processes of financial institutions, not just risk management, but in areas like credit assessment, investment analysis, portfolio management. The paper describes this as a definitive shift from mere advocacy in the earlier stages to standardization now, reaching a systematic, comprehensive, mandatory stage, at least for certain key entities.
So it's evolved into quite a multi-layered policy system now, with direction coming from the top and implementation happening through various bodies.
Precisely. The paper maps out the current structure. You've got top-down guidance from national strategies like dual carbon
Yeah.
and the 14th five-year plan. Then the primary regulatory bodies overseeing listed companies are the China Securities Regulatory Commission, CSRC, and for the SOEs, it's SASAC.
And the exchanges are the executioners.
The stock exchanges, SSE and SCSE, act as the key execution bodies. They implement the rules through their listing requirements and specific reporting guidelines. And various policy documents connect these different layers together.
And within this system, the paper points to the benchmark role played by the large enterprises, particularly those SOEs. They're setting the pace.
Yes, they are definitely positioned as leaders in driving the overall market transformation. Often, mandatory or more stringent requirements are first applied to these large entities. This sets an example, builds capacity, and the practices can eventually filter down to smaller companies over time.
Let's look a little closer at the roles of those key regulatory bodies. How does the CSRC exert its influence on ESG disclosure? What's their main function?
The CSRC, as the main regulator of China's securities market, operates at a macro level. They set the overall framework. They're responsible for formulating and refining the regulatory system for listed companies' information disclosure generally. And they consistently emphasize the strategic importance of ESG information, both for risk management and for investment decision-making in the market.
How does their emphasis translate into action on the ground?
Well, the CSRC guides the exchanges by revising foundational rules, like those guidelines on corporate governance for listed companies we mentioned. That then prompts the exchanges to develop more detailed, self-regulatory guidelines specific to ESG. They also actively enforce compliance with ESG information disclosure requirements during their regular supervision and on-site inspections of listed companies. They make sure companies are taking these requirements seriously.
Okay, so CSRC sets the stage and oversees compliance. What about SAS and its specific focus on the SOEs? You mentioned high requirements.
Yes, SAS has very high and specific requirements for central SOEs when it comes to ESG management and disclosure. They don't just ask for reports, they mandate the integration of sustainable development concepts directly into the core strategy of these enterprises.
Right into the strategy.
Yes, and into their operational management, even into their overseas investments and supply chain activities. The paper notes that SASE even established a dedicated social responsibility bureau back in March 2022 to provide specific guidance on areas like safety production, environmental protection, poverty alleviation, rural revitalization, and hitting those dual carbon targets.
A dedicated bureau just for this, and they've released key documents to back this up.
Absolutely. Documents like the work plan for improving the quality of SOE-controlled listed companies, and the guidance on high-standard fulfillment of social responsibility by central enterprises in the new era. These set clear, high-level requirements for both the scope and the quality of ESG information disclosure by SOEs.
And this is why the paper positions SOEs as leaders.
Largely, yes. It's because of these dedicated structures, the very clear top-down mandates from SAS, and that crucial linkage of ESG performance to their overall evaluation. They're definitely leading the charge in domestic ESG practice.
Okay, so SOEs are a key policy tool for driving ESG forward. How do the exchanges, the SSE and SCSE, put these requirements into practice on a day-to-day basis for all the listed companies under their watch?
The exchanges are the critical implementing bodies. They translate those macro requirements from CSRC and SASC into actionable rules through their listing rules, their detailed regulatory guidelines, and practical report compilation guides.
And the paper highlights their evolution over time.
Yes, starting with primarily advocacy or recommendation in the early days, they've moved clearly towards semi-mandatory and now mandatory disclosure for specific groups of companies, particularly with the introduction of these new 2024 guidelines.
And they used a phased approach initially, starting with certain companies to test the waters.
Exactly. To prepare the market and build capacity, the exchanges initially focused on strengthening ESG requirements for specific indices or sample companies like those in the SSE 180 index or the Star 50 index on Shanghai's Tech Board, as well as companies listed on both domestic and overseas exchanges, the A+H shares, and crucially those SOE-controlled companies. This allowed for a gradual rollout and a learning process before mandatory requirements were expanded more broadly.
Can you detail the core policy documents and guidelines released by SSE and SCSE in 2024? They seem absolutely central to this current mandatory phase.
Yes, these 2024 guidelines are really foundational for understanding the current mandatory landscape in China. On April 12, 2024, the Shanghai Stock Exchange issued its Self-Regulatory Guidelines Number 14 Sustainable Development Report trial.
Okay, Guideline 14. What's key about it?
This document is key because it clearly defines the initial mandatory scope for these Sustainable Development Reports. This includes constituent companies of the SSE 180 Index, constituent companies of the Star 50 Index, companies listed on both domestic and overseas exchanges simultaneously, A plus H shares, and companies controlled by state-owned enterprises.
So for those specific groups of companies, reporting is now required, not optional.
That's correct. It's mandatory for them for fiscal years ending after 2024. The guidelines also specify the disclosure timing. The reports must be submitted by April 30th of the following year. So the reports covering 2025 are due by April 30th, 2026.
Got it.
They also specify the format, internal approval procedures, and a key principle introduced in these guidelines, which we should really understand because it's globally relevant now, is double materiality.
Double materiality. Okay, let's slow down there for a second. That's a really key concept popping up everywhere now, but it's explicitly in these Chinese rules. What exactly does it mean?
It's a crucial principle because it requires companies to look at sustainability issues from two equally important perspectives. First, there's financial materiality.
Financial materiality.
This asks, how do ESG issues and related risks like climate change, water scarcity, social unrest, or opportunities like renewable energy or sustainable products, how do they impact the company's financial performance and its value creation? It's about how the outside world affects the company's bottom line.
Okay, how the world impacts the company financially. Makes sense. And the second part?
The second part is impact materiality. This asks the opposite question. How do the company's own operations and its value chain activities impact the environment and society?
So the company's footprint on the world.
Exactly. This looks at things like the company's greenhouse gas emissions, its waste generation, its impact on local communities, or its labor practices throughout its supply chain. It's about the company's effect on the world.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about how might new environmental rules cost me money, which is financial materiality, but also how does my factory's pollution impact the local river and community, which is impact materiality.
Exactly right. It's a two-way street. By requiring companies to consider both perspectives, the double materiality principle helps ensure the disclosure is relevant not only to investors focused purely on financial risk, but also to a much broader range of stakeholders, employees, communities, NGOs, regulators, who are concerned with the company's wider impact on the planet and society.
So it helps focus disclosure efforts on the issues that are truly significant from both angles.
Precisely. It ensures a more holistic view.
That's a really helpful principle for ensuring comprehensive reporting. You mentioned the Shenzhen Stock Exchange also issued guidelines in 2024. Did they follow a similar path?
Yes, around the same time, also in April 2024, the Shenzhen Stock Exchange released its Self-Regulatory Guidelines Number 17 Sustainable Development Report trial. This document provided perhaps even more detailed guidance, listing 21 specific issues that companies are expected to cover in their reports.
21 specific issues. Like what?
These issues range from concrete environmental topics like pollutant emissions and ecological protection to social issues like rural revitalization, innovation-driven development, and protecting employee rights and interests. It gives companies a pretty clear roadmap of what's expected.
Provides more granularity.
It does. And later, in November 2024, the SCSE went even further and released a Guidance on the Compilation of Sustainable Development, ESG reports for listed companies, draft for comment. This guidance provided even more detailed rules covering the scope of the report, specific data collection methodologies, recommended disclosure methods, all aimed at improving the comparability and transparency of reporting across the companies listed on their exchange.
Okay, so very detailed domestic requirements are now in place or coming into force. But the paper also mentions that alongside adhering to these domestic rules, Chinese companies are encouraged to align with international frameworks like GRI, SSB, and TCFD. Why is that alignment still important, given the detailed domestic requirements?
That alignment with international frameworks is seen as crucial for enhancing transparency and comparability on a global scale. While the domestic regulations provide the mandatory baseline and structure specifically for the Chinese market, referencing and aligning with globally recognized standards allows Chinese companies to present their ESG information in a format that is familiar and understandable to international investors, asset managers, and other stakeholders outside of China.
So it helps them speak the same language as global capital.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And how does that benefit the companies themselves, especially those operating internationally or seeking foreign investment?
Well, the paper frames this as key to Chinese companies' sustainable competitiveness in international markets. By adhering to globally recognized standards, they can build trust and credibility with overseas investors, financial institutions, and potential business partners. This can make it easier to attract foreign investment, participate smoothly in international supply chains, and expand their global presence. It's about speaking that international language without borders that the ISSB is trying to unify, making sure their story lands effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. Really essential for companies with global ambitions. Okay, let's look at the market practice data the paper provides. What do the numbers show regarding how many A-share companies in China are actually publishing ESG reports now? Is it taking off?
The data clearly shows accelerating momentum. The paper reports that in 2023, 2,220 A-share listed companies published ESG, CSR, or Sustainable Development Reports.
Okay, 2,220. What percentage is that?
That represented a disclosure rate of 41.56% among all A-share companies. And importantly, this was a significant jump. The paper says about 20% higher than the disclosure rate in 2022 and a roughly 51% higher than back in 2021. So rapid growth.
Wow, that's a steep curve. And that rate continued to climb into 2024 as these new mandatory rules were approaching.
Yes, it did. As of June 2024, the disclosure rate for the 2023 annual reports, which would be the first year potentially subject to the new mandatory requirements for some of those key companies, had further increased to 57.83%.
Almost 60%. That really demonstrates the impact of that regulatory push towards standardization and mandatory disclosure.
It does. And the paper specifically highlights the disclosure rate for those SOE-controlled listed companies, the ones SAS is pushing hard. How high is their rate?
That rate is particularly high, reflecting SAS's stringent requirements. The paper notes that the disclosure rate for SOE-controlled listed companies reached an impressive 95% as of June 2024.
95%.
Yeah, this aligns perfectly with their designated role as leaders and benchmarks in the domestic ESG landscape. They are definitely reporting.
What about differences across industries and regions within China? Are some sectors or areas ahead of others?
In terms of industries, the paper finds that the finance industry has the highest overall disclosure coverage, exceeding 90%. Utility and energy sectors also have relatively high rates, over 60%, which, makes sense given their significant environmental impact.
Right. And regions. Is it still concentrated in the East?
The paper indicates those regional differences are actually shrinking. As of August 2024, the ESG report disclosure rate for A-share listed companies in the Western regions reached 45%. That was a notable 13% increase compared to 2023, showing increasing adoption across different geographies. The gap is closing.
That's good to see. And given the national strategy, what are the key issues companies are focusing on in these reports? What themes keep coming up?
Unsurprisingly, the paper highlights that topics directly linked to national priorities have become the most widely discussed and reported on. Dual carbon goals, energy efficiency measures, and the development of green supply chains are among the most prominent themes. This reflects both the regulatory focus and the growing investor and public attention on these areas in China.
Makes sense. Now, the paper makes a really interesting distinction between the characteristics of ESG disclosure practices by those large state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, and those of Chinese private enterprises. Let's break down those differences, starting with the large SOEs. What's their first key feature, according to the paper?
Okay, the first key feature of Chinese large SOEs' ESG disclosure is their very close alignment with national strategy and policy. The paper explains that these companies are often seen as carrying higher social and political responsibilities, so their disclosure content is strongly tied to national directions.
How does that national alignment show up in concrete reporting examples? What do they talk about?
We see this clearly in their reporting on responding to the dual carbon goals, for instance, or their participation in major national initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. The paper provides specific examples like energy SOEs, Sinopec, and PetroChina.
What do they report?
In their ESG reports, they detail their specific measures for emissions reduction, their efforts in developing clean energy sources, and how they conduct environmental impact analysis within their core oil and gas processes. They also report on the environmental and social compliance of their overseas projects, particularly those under the Belt and Road, making sure they adhere to local regulations.
So demonstrating contribution to national goals.
Exactly. They've even set phased targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the oil and gas sector, directly linking their ESG strategy to those national climate goals. Their reporting isn't just about business impact, it's about demonstrating their contribution to national objectives.
Okay, very policy aligned. What's a second characteristic of SOE disclosure identified?
The second feature is the establishment of robust organization and assessment mechanisms. Driven by SAS's clear requirements, large SOEs typically have dedicated high-level ESG committees or social responsibility departments.
Formal structures in place.
Yes. And the preparation and review of their reports often involve direct oversight from senior leadership and formal review and approval by the board of directors. It's embedded in the governance.
Are there examples showing how this structure impacts the reports themselves?
Yes, the paper gives examples from major infrastructure, SOEs, like China State Construction Engineering Corporation, CSCEC, and China Railway Construction Corporation, CRCC. They often combine their ESG and social responsibility reports, and these reports explicitly state they've been reviewed and approved by the board.
And what's inside those reports?
The reports provide detailed disclosure across areas like safety production, green building practices in their construction projects, and their broader social impact, showcasing their role as industry leaders. The paper also notes again that SASIC's assessment mechanisms often link executive compensation directly to the completion of social responsibility targets, further embedding ESG into their performance evaluation system.
So a very structured, top-down, policy-driven approach with clear governance. And the third feature for SOEs, what's that?
The third feature highlighted is a strong focus on strict supply chain compliance and full coverage management. The paper suggests that SOEs, particularly those in heavy asset and energy-intensive sectors, tend to have more stringent supply chain compliance requirements compared to many private enterprises.
How do they demonstrate that focus in their reports? What evidence do they provide?
Their ESG reports often include detailed sections on supplier environmental standards, labor conditions, and the results of compliance reviews they've conducted. This is often supported by specific management and audit mechanisms they have in place for the supply chain.
Any specific example?
The paper uses the example of State Grid, the massive power utility. Their ESG report clearly details their supplier screening criteria. These criteria explicitly include assessments of suppliers' environmental impact, their social responsibility performance, and product quality. This ensures that high standards are maintained throughout their extensive and critical supply chain. This comprehensive, compliance-focused supply chain management is presented as a distinct characteristic of SOE ESG disclosure.
Okay, so large SOEs, characterized by close alignment with national strategy, robust internal structures and governance, and strict supply chain compliance, often driven by top-down mandates from SASAC. How do Chinese private enterprises compare? What's a first key feature, according to the paper?
Chinese private enterprises, especially those in dynamic sectors like high-tech, e-commerce, and advanced manufacturing, are characterized differently. Their first feature is being more innovation-driven and having a stronger tendency to align with international standards in their ESG disclosure.
Why is that? What's driving them?
The paper suggests this is largely driven by intense market competition and often a more global vision for expansion. They need to compete on a global stage.
How does that play out in their reporting? Can you give some examples from the paper?
The paper uses Alibaba as a prime example. Initially, Alibaba's reports focused more on corporate philanthropy, sort of traditional CSR. However, as the company grew rapidly and diversified into areas like e-commerce, cloud computing with Aliyun, and logistics, its ESG reporting quickly evolved.
How did it evolve?
It started to integrate issues like environmental management, complex data compliance challenges, user privacy protection, things directly relevant to their expanding business model. This shows a trend of continuous innovation and quickly adapting their ESG focus.
And do they actively benchmark against international frameworks, as you mentioned?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
The paper highlights that Alibaba began aligning its reporting with the TCFD framework as early as its 2021 report. They provided detailed disclosure on their exposure to climate risks and opportunities, their strategy for addressing climate change, and their governance structure related to these issues.
So communicating in that global language.
Exactly. The paper also notes that their reports showcase specific initiatives, like Allianz's efforts to improve energy efficiency in its data centers to reduce carbon emissions. This demonstrates them connecting with international standards within the context of global competition.
That makes sense. Market-driven companies competing globally need to adopt those globally recognized languages and standards. What's the second feature of the private enterprises approach identified in the paper?
The second feature is integrating social value creation directly into their business models. The paper contrasts this with SOEs, which, as we said, are often driven by policy directive. Private enterprises facing fierce market competition are perhaps more focused on finding ways to combine public good or social impact with commercial returns, creating a win-win situation.
Can you give an example of a private enterprise integrating social value with its core business model like that?
BYD, the electric vehicle maker, is an excellent example used in the paper. Their core business is new energy vehicles, which inherently contributes to the green transition and global emission reduction. Their success isn't just commercial, it's intrinsically linked to creating social value.
And their report reflects this.
Yes, their ESG report details innovative initiatives like their battery recycling system, their carbon emission control measures in manufacturing, green operations across their facilities, and their strategy for promoting green mobility globally.
Do they have specific structures for this, similar to how SOEs have committees?
Yes, while perhaps different in form, the paper notes that BYD's report describes the establishment of a dedicated carbon emissions control committee. This committee sets clear targets for reducing carbon emissions across the company. They also detail how their technological innovation helps them continuously reduce the carbon footprint of their vehicle production.
So tightly linking environmental good with their core business.
Right. This approach, tightly linking environmental good with their core business and using it to build their brand image, is highlighted as a characteristic of private enterprises achieving both environmental and business success simultaneously.
Okay, driven by innovation and business model integration. What's their third characteristic, according to the
So
paper?
the third feature is rapid iteration and ecosystem collaboration. Private enterprises, particularly in tech, tend to be more agile in quickly integrating new ESG issues into their practices as they emerge. And they're often more inclined to collaborate with partners across their entire value chain or ecosystem.
How is this agility and collaboration reflected in their reporting? What examples are given?
The paper uses JD.com, the e-commerce giant, as an illustration. Since 2018, JD.com has rapidly expanded the scope of its ESG reporting. It includes content on green logistics, the use of environmentally friendly packaging, and ethical management within its complex supply chain. They also benchmark their efforts against international frameworks like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, demonstrating their responsibility in the global market.
And they've set clear carbon targets as their business grew.
Yes, exactly. As their logistics business, a major source of emissions, grew significantly, the paper notes that JD.com explicitly set dual carbon goals in its 2023 ESG report. The report provides specific data and details on initiatives such as green warehousing technologies, the deployment of smart logistics vehicles, and measures to reduce e-commerce packaging waste.
How is this framed in the paper?
This is framed as adapting their strategy quickly, integrating resources across their business ecosystem, like suppliers and delivery partners, and driving a green transition throughout their entire value chain through collaboration, not just within their own walls.
Okay, so it sounds like private enterprises, often driven by market competition and a global outlook, are perhaps faster to innovate, integrate social value into their core business, and collaborate across their value chains compared to the more policy-driven, compliance-focused SOEs. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary of the distinctions highlighted by the paper based on the specific examples provided. Each group clearly has unique strengths and different primary drivers, shaping their approach to ESG disclosure and practice in China.
Fascinating differences. Okay, we've covered the global context, the evolving value of ESG, and China's unique policy journey and corporate practices. Now, let's look at the challenges that still persist in this space and how companies are navigating them, as well as the major trends shaping the future. What are the key challenges the paper identifies that companies are still grappling with, despite all this progress?
Right. The paper reiterates some ongoing challenges. Despite the progress we've discussed, there are still persistent gaps in the quality, the consistency, and the overall transparency of disclosed ESG data. It's not perfect yet.
Still hard to compare apples to apples sometimes.
Exactly. There's also still a lack of fully unified operational standards that companies can easily apply across all aspects of their business globally. And the risk of selective disclosure, or greenwashing, which we talked about earlier, is still a very real concern.
Absolutely. The paper highlights that insufficient third-party assurance or external verification remains a challenge in many areas. This leaves room for companies, intentionally or unintentionally, to engage in that selective disclosure or outright greenwashing. Without independent checks, stakeholders find it harder to fully trust the information being reported, especially when it comes to potentially negative impacts or risks.
That trust deficit is a major hurdle. So given these challenges, how are leading companies, or how should companies, communicate effectively and credibly in this environment? The paper outlines several strategies. The first one mentioned is integrated reporting. What does that involve exactly?
Integrated reporting is a strategy where companies combine their financial information with their ESG or broader sustainability information into a single coherent report. Typically, this is called an integrated report. Frameworks like the International IR Framework provide guidance on how to do this effectively.
And what's the benefit of putting financial and ESG information together like that in one place? Why do it?
The paper points to several benefits. On a practical level, it can streamline the reporting process by reducing the need for multiple separate reports, which saves time and effort.
Efficiency, okay.
More importantly, though, by presenting financial and non-financial information side by side, it helps investors and other stakeholders see the connections and the dependencies between a company's environmental and social performance and its financial outcomes.
Making that link explicit.
Exactly. This enhances transparency and provides a much clearer picture of how the company creates long-term value across different forms of capital, not just financial, but also natural, social, human capital, and so on. It tells a more complete story.
Does the paper give an example of a company effectively using integrated reporting?
Yes, it uses HSBC Holdings as an example. HSBC integrates a detailed sustainable development section right within its main annual report. They use risk assessment models and present case studies to quantify and illustrate how environmental and social risks can impact their core banking and investment businesses.
Showing the financial relevance.
Right. They also regularly report on their ESG progress to their board and at shareholder meetings, demonstrating that these issues are integrated into their highest levels of governance and decision-making. The paper notes this integrated approach helps them gain higher transparency and recognition, particularly in global capital markets.
That strategy really helps show how ESG is connected to the core business, not just a side issue. Another strategy discussed is building a credible disclosure system. This includes using international frameworks and, importantly, third-party assurance. We've talked about frameworks, but how do they specifically help build credibility in communication?
Using those international frameworks like GRI, SSB, TCFD, and now ISSB provides that standardized structure and common language we keep coming back to. While they help ensure compliance, their global recognition means they function as a widely understood communication platform across different cultures and regions.
So stakeholders know what they're looking at.
Exactly. For companies, including those in China, the paper stresses the need to align their domestic reporting requirements, like those from SSE and SCSE, with the compatibility and transparency expected by these international standards. This is necessary to meet the diverse needs of both domestic and international stakeholders effectively.
And the paper offered a Chinese example of aligning with a global framework, didn't it?
Yes, it used Ping An, the large Chinese insurance company. In their 2020 Climate Risk Management Report, Ping An conducted detailed scenario analysis for climate risks and opportunities, and they explicitly structured their report to fully reference the TCFD recommendations.
So they used the TCFD pillars.
Right. Their report detailed specific measures they are taking to address climate change within their insurance and investment businesses, and they publicly disclosed the results of potential climate stress tests. The paper notes that this structured approach, aligned with an international standard like TCFD, earned them positive feedback from regulators and investors for its rigor and transparency.
Okay, so using frameworks provides structure and comparability, boosting credibility. What about the second part of building a credible system, third-party assurance? How does that directly tackle the greenwashing risk we were discussing?
Third-party assurance is presented as a primary method for boosting the credibility of ESG reports and combating selective disclosure. The paper explains it involves independent external parties auditors, essentially verifying key sustainability data, processes, and claims made in the report.
What kind of information is typically verified in these assurance engagements?
Independent auditors can verify things like a company's greenhouse gas emissions data, water usage figures, waste generation stats, information on labor practices, community impact metrics, compliance with environmental regulations, a whole range of things. The paper even suggests that in areas where financial and social or environmental performance are tightly intertwined, companies might consider combined financial and social audits.
Interesting idea. The paper provides a specific example of a major company working with an audit firm for assurance, right?
Yes, it details Unilever's practice, citing their 2022 annual report. Unilever engaged PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, to provide limited assurance over specific non-financial performance data.
Limited assurance meaning not a full financial audit level, but still independent verification.
Exactly. The scope of this assurance included critical metrics from their Sustainable Development Program, things like their Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, total water usage, production waste figures, and key health and safety indicators.
And how did PwC conduct this limited assurance? What did they do?
According to Unilever's report, as cited in the paper, PwC's process involved sampling data, conducting interviews with relevant personnel at Unilever, and reviewing documents related to Unilever's ESG data collection, calculation methods, and the internal control systems they had in place for those specific metrics.
So, checking the process and the numbers.
Right. Based on this work, PwC then issued an Independent Assurance Practitioner's Limited Assurance Report, which is included right within Unilever's main annual report. It provided PwC's opinion and often includes suggestions for improvement.
What are the key benefits Unilever gains from going through this detailed third-party assurance process? Why bother?
The paper highlights two main benefits. First, and most obviously, it significantly enhances the credibility of Unilever's reported environmental and social performance data in the eyes of investors, regulators, and the public. Having a reputable external firm like PwC verify the data adds a crucial layer of trust.
Makes sense. And the second benefit?
The second benefit is internal. The professional feedback and insights provided by the audit firm help Unilever's own internal teams identify potential weaknesses in their data collection or management systems. This drives continuous improvement in their sustainability strategy execution and the overall quality of their disclosure over time.
So it makes the data more reliable for everyone, including the company itself. That's really valuable. The paper also addresses the ethical risk, the temptation for companies to maybe hide negative information or downplay risks. How can companies manage that motivation? It must be tempting sometimes.
The paper acknowledges that, yes, even with mandatory rules, the impulse to only highlight the positive and downplay risks can definitely exist. To counter this ethical risk, companies need to establish robust, long-term oversight mechanisms, and this has to start at the highest levels the board of directors and senior management need to set the tone.
But it's not just internal oversight, right? You need external checks too.
Exactly. The paper argues it requires a combination of internal and external checks. Internal checks can involve things like cross-departmental review processes to ensure data is consistent and complete across different functions, making sure marketing isn't saying something different from operations. External checks are crucial and include independent audits, like that third-party assurance we just discussed, and also mechanisms for public and stakeholder supervision, allowing outsiders to raise flags.
The paper uses Intel as an example of a company that has put in place a kind of layered system to manage this ethical risk. How does Intel approach it?
Intel, in its corporate responsibility report cited in the paper, describes a multi-layered system for supervising and reviewing its ESG information disclosure. It extends right from the board level down to the business units. They specifically mention that their board's corporate governance and nominating committee annually reviews key ESG risks and performance data and discusses the disclosure strategy with senior management.
So the board is actively involved in oversight. What about internal processes below the board?
Internally, Intel's corporate sustainability department coordinates with cross-functional teams, people from finance, legal, HR, supply chain, etc. These teams regularly cross-verify core data, such as greenhouse gas emissions figures and data related to human rights in their supply chain, to try and ensure its accuracy and completeness before it goes out.
And do they also use external assurance for key data points?
Yes, they do. The paper notes that Intel hires external assurance providers, like CEIBS, to conduct independent audits of their Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions data, and also certain supply chain performance metrics. And the statement from that external assurance provider is included in their report for transparency.
And how do they gather external feedback to potentially uncover issues or blind spots?
Intel actively engages in stakeholder engagement. They conduct regular dialogues with investors, NGOs, community representatives, and others. This process helps them collect external feedback, which can highlight potential instances of reporting the good, hiding the bad, or identify areas where their reporting is perceived as lacking transparency, prompting them to make improvements.
So it's a combination of top-down board oversight, internal cross-checks, independent external assurance, and external stakeholder feedback.
Exactly. The paper describes Intel's system as a combined top-down and bottom-up supervision model, reinforced by independent third-party assurance and continuous stakeholder feedback. The idea is that this layered approach collectively helps ensure the objectivity and completeness of their ESG reporting and manages that ethical risk.
That's a pretty sophisticated approach to building trust. Beyond these formal reports and verification processes, the paper discusses shifting to everyday multi-channel communication, moving past just publishing an annual report. Why is that becoming necessary?
Well, in the current digital age, with information flowing so rapidly and public scrutiny being so high, relying solely on a comprehensive annual report once a year is just no longer sufficient. Stakeholders, especially younger generations, consumers, employees, expect more frequent and accessible updates.
They want real-time info.
Pretty much. The paper argues that continuous communication through company websites, social media platforms, and even internal and external training sessions is vital for building trust and maintaining a positive public image around ESG.
So it's about integrating ESG into the ongoing brand communication and engagement, not just a once-a-year data dump.
Exactly. It shifts ESG disclosure from being a periodic retrospective activity to a dynamic, continuous process. The paper uses Meituan, a major Chinese tech company, as an example.
What does Meituan do?
And Meituan uses its official Weibo and WeChat accounts, along with video platforms, to provide real-time updates on its green initiatives, things like the use of unmanned delivery vehicles, efforts to reduce packaging waste from food delivery. They even include brief sustainability updates in their quarterly operational announcements to investors.
That makes ESG feel much more integrated into the company's daily operations and its brand story, doesn't it?
It does. This real-time online interaction weaves ESG into their ongoing communication, increasing public awareness of their environmental and social practices in a more engaging, timely way. The paper also briefly mentions Volkswagen Group using its website for sustainability report updates, and Microsoft leveraging its WeChat official account and a mini program to share a sustainability dashboard, articles, and videos. It just further illustrates this trend towards multi-channel, continuous ESG communication.
That naturally leads to the next strategy discussed, leveraging technology for communication. How is technology changing the game for ESG disclosure and communication?
Technology is fundamentally transforming how ESG data is collected, analyzed, verified, and communicated. It's enhancing both the accuracy and, frankly, the persuasiveness of disclosure. The paper highlights several key applications.
Like big data and AI, how are they being used?
Yes. Big data and artificial intelligence can be used for real-time monitoring and sophisticated analysis of ESG performance data. This is particularly useful in industries with complex operations like heavy manufacturing or energy production. The paper provides the example of Baowu Steel Group, one of the world's largest steel producers.
What have they implemented?
They've implemented an online environmental risk monitoring platform across their steel bases. This platform allows for stable, continuous data access from sensors and systems, and it enables granular, process-level carbon accounting, management, and analysis. The paper notes Baowu is the first company in the mining sector to have such a sophisticated carbon management platform.
How does using that kind of advanced technology improve their disclosure? What's the benefit?
The paper suggests that companies using such systems should actually describe the digital processes and maybe even the AI logic used within their reports. This demonstrates to both domestic and international stakeholders how the data is collected continuously, how its quality is controlled, and how advanced analytics are applied. It adds a significant layer of credibility to the reported information because you're showing the how behind the numbers, not just presenting the final figure.
Showing your work, basically. What about blockchain and traceability? How does that fit in?
Blockchain technology is proving particularly valuable for building trust and credibility in supply chain disclosure. This is an area that's often notoriously difficult to verify. The paper uses the example of Carrefour, the international retailer.
What did Carrefour do with blockchain?
They've been using IBM Food Trust, which is a blockchain-based platform since 2019 for the traceability of specific products like some of their private label chicken and milk. And this practice is included in Carrefour's Universal Registration document, which integrates its CSR report.
How does using blockchain for traceability benefit consumers and disclosure? What can you do with it?
Consumers or auditors can scan a QR code on the product packaging and access the traceability information that's been recorded on the blockchain. This could include details like the product's origin, where the animals were fed, inspection times, points along the logistics path. It verifies the product's journey.
And the blockchain aspect makes it trustworthy.
Critically, yes. Because it's on a blockchain, it helps prevent data tampering after the fact. This provides much more transparent and trustworthy evidence for ESG reports related to responsible sourcing and ethical supply chain practices. The paper suggests that companies disclosing such applications should detail the scope of the blockchain use and how they collaborate with auditors to ensure the integrity of the data being recorded on the platform.
That definitely makes supply chain claims much harder to greenwash if the data is immutable. The paper also mentions shared platforms, particularly useful for smaller entities. What's the idea there?
Yes, this is presented as a practical solution for collecting and verifying data, especially from numerous small and medium-sized enterprises or institutions located within a specific area like an industrial park or maybe an ecological city development. The example given is the Sino-Singapore Tianjin Eco-City.
What do they have there?
They have established a green data integration system since 2021. This centralized platform collects energy consumption and emission data from all the enterprises and institutions within the eco-city boundaries. The data is often verified monthly or quarterly by the platform operator.
And how does that system help with ESG data and disclosure for the companies involved?
For scattered SMEs or smaller entities, relying on such a shared, verifiable platform can significantly simplify their data collection and reporting. It reduces their individual costs compared to each trying to build their own complex monitoring systems. And when companies located in these areas report using data from these platforms, they can describe the system, the data collection scope, the verification process, and the involvement of government or third-party institutions. This provides authoritative backing for the authenticity of their disclosure, making it more credible, particularly to global investors looking at smaller companies in their portfolio.
So technology is enabling more accurate, verifiable, and dynamic ESG reporting across different scales of business, from huge multinationals to SMEs in specific zones. All right, the paper also looks at a specific challenge for Chinese companies: enhancing the global communication of their localized content. How can they effectively bridge that gap between reporting on domestic policy achievements and meeting international expectations?
This is a key challenge, especially for Chinese companies looking to succeed on the global stage. They need to effectively map their achievements and contributions, which are often deeply tied to specific national strategies like dual carbon or broader social development goals like rural revitalization, onto those international sustainability frameworks like GRI, SAB, ISSB, and TCFD that global investors understand.
How can they do that mapping effectively while still adhering to international standards and being understood by global stakeholders? It sounds tricky.
The paper suggests clarifying how domestic targets and initiatives align with equivalent themes, metrics, or indicators within the international frameworks. It uses Sinopec as an example again. Their 2023 Sustainable Development Report set clear key performance indicators, KPIs, for initiatives such as their green refining upgrade and developing low-carbon energy supply.
Okay, domestic initiatives. How do they link them globally?
The paper notes that Sinopec explicitly matched these KPIs and the related reporting content with the disclosure requirements of the TCFD framework, particularly those related to emissions control and climate strategy. They showed how their actions contribute to goals understood within the TCFD structure.
So they're essentially translating their national strategy-driven goals into a globally recognized reporting structure.
Exactly. This helps overseas investors evaluate their emission reduction progress and energy transition efforts using a framework they are already familiar with. The paper also emphasizes the importance of clarifying data definitions, for instance, explaining any differences between domestic carbon accounting standards and international definitions like TCFD Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, or maybe providing bridge data if possible.
Little details matter for comparison.
They do.
Okay.
And using digital presentations and reports for short, medium, and long-term goals can also significantly aid international comparison and understanding. This approach allows companies to demonstrate their responsiveness to domestic policy while ensuring their achievements are interpretable and comparable globally.
What about tailoring the reports for different audiences? The paper mentions multi-language and audience differentiation.
This is another crucial aspect of global communication. The paper suggests tailoring the report content and focus for different readers, especially when producing both Chinese and English versions.
How might they differ?
For instance, a Chinese report might provide more detailed narrative information on initiatives directly related to domestic social priorities, like inclusive finance or rural revitalization, which resonate strongly locally. An English version, aimed primarily at overseas investors, might focus more heavily on quantitative data and metrics that align closely with international standards like IFRS or TCFD, and perhaps highlight financial materiality more explicitly.
So the core data should be consistent, but the narrative emphasis and the examples used might be adjusted for the audience.
Precisely. The paper advises ensuring core data remains consistent across versions while making moderate adjustments to the narrative, the case studies used, and the emphasis points based on the target audience's likely interests and what information they are typically looking for. It also suggests including brief notes in the report's preface or appendix to explain the translation principles used or any minor differences in data methodologies between versions, just to maintain overall transparency and consistency.
That makes sense. And the paper also mentions collaborating with local authorities or academia. How does that help with the global communication of localized content? Seems counterintuitive.
It's about credibility. Collaborating with reputable domestic research institutions, universities, or relevant government bodies can add significant credibility to the reported information, especially when presenting data or achievements that are rooted in the specific Chinese context or involve complex local regulations and technologies. The paper calls this achieving dual endorsement.
Dual endorsement, leveraging domestic expertise alongside international standards.
Exactly, leveraging domestic expertise and authority, plus aligning with international standards and frameworks.
Can you give an example of that collaboration being leveraged effectively?
Sinopec is used again as an example here. Their 2023 report mentions collaborating with research teams from the prestigious Chinese Academy of Sciences on advanced projects like carbon capture and storage, CCS, and hydrogen energy utilization. By briefly detailing the scope of this collaboration, the technological routes being explored, and the phased results achieved in the report, they highlight the professionalism and authority of domestic research institutions in these key technological areas relevant to climate goals.
And how does highlighting that specific domestic collaboration benefit them globally?
It allows both domestic and overseas investors to quickly cross-reference the company's emission reduction achievements and R&D investments using established international emission and energy evaluation metrics, while also knowing that the underlying data and expertise are backed by credible domestic authorities. The paper frames this as leveraging a domestic authority plus international framework advantage. This helps gain recognition and trust from overseas investors who can understand and evaluate the Chinese company's environmental and social performance within a familiar global climate and energy efficiency discourse, but with added local validation.
That's a smart strategy. Okay, these strategies for global communication are quite detailed, suggesting a sophisticated approach probably more suited for larger companies. What about differentiated strategies for SMEs and startups? They might have very limited resources for comprehensive ESG reporting. Does the paper address them?
Yes, it does. The paper acknowledges the significant resource constraints, time, money, expertise faced by SMEs and startups when it comes to full-scale ESG disclosure. However, it strongly stresses the importance of these smaller entities starting early, even if it's on a smaller scale.
Why is starting early so important for them?
It outlines several benefits. Starting early helps them establish internal data collection processes from the beginning. It clarifies potential ESG risks and opportunities relevant to their specific business. It aids internal organization and management. The paper uses the term "shoj," which means sorting out or getting things in order. It prepares them for future, potentially mandatory requirements down the line. It can even lead to cost reductions through improved efficiency identified during the process. And, perhaps most importantly, it significantly enhances their competitiveness in the market.
So even a small step is better than waiting until it's mandated or demanded.
Absolutely. The paper suggests a lightweight disclosure approach for these entities. They should focus on identifying and reporting on the key material issues that are most relevant to their specific business model, their industry, and their scale. Don't try to boil the ocean.
Focus on what matters most for them.
Right. The immediate goal is to meet basic compliance requirements where applicable and, crucially, to build a positive corporate image. This proactive approach, even if limited in scope initially, can be critical for future market access, especially as larger companies increasingly demand ESG data from their supply chains. It's also important for attracting investment, as investors are looking at ESG factors even in smaller, earlier stage companies now, and for securing partnerships.
So the paper frames it as both a current challenge for SMEs to implement, but also a significant opportunity for their long-term sustainable development.
Exactly. Get started early, focus on what's material, even if it's lightweight at first. It's critical for future growth and resilience.
Okay, we've covered the challenges and the strategies for navigating them. Now let's look ahead. Building on all these points, what are the core challenges that will continue to shape the landscape, and what are the major future trends identified in the paper for 2025 and beyond?
Right. Building on the current dynamics, the paper identifies several key forces that will really define the future of ESG disclosure. One major trend is simply accelerating convergence.
We've discussed global convergence already, but how is it expected to accelerate further? What's the driver?
The primary driver of this acceleration, according to the paper, is the emergence and adoption of the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB standards, IFRS S1 and S2. The paper predicts that these standards will significantly drive global alignment.
Why ISSB specifically?
Because multinational corporations seeking to simplify their reporting obligations across different countries and capital markets are likely to prioritize adopting the ISSB baseline framework. It offers that promise of a single global language for investors. While specific requirements in regions like the US and EU might retain some differences due to local politics or priorities, the broad aim of global comparability will push companies towards the ISSB as a common denominator.
And other regions, like China and Europe, will continue to link their local rules to this international context. They won't just operate in isolation.
Exactly. The paper notes that markets like China, with its new A-share mandatory guidelines, the EU, whose CSRD impacts many non-EU companies operating within or supplying to the EU, and countries in Southeast Asia are actively exploring how to link their local regulations to the international context provided by ISSB, TCFD, and GRI.
So not necessarily one identical standard everywhere overnight.
Probably not. The prediction isn't for one single identical standard everywhere immediately, but a strong trend towards compatibility and mutual recognition of different regional standards. Think of it like different dialects of the same language emerging. This means companies will increasingly need to navigate a landscape requiring them to multi-align their reporting, satisfying various sets of requirements that are hopefully becoming more interoperable.
Okay, navigating multiple interconnected systems. What about technology breakthroughs? How will tech continue to change ESG reporting?
Technology is expected to drive a fundamental shift, moving from static, often backward-looking disclosure towards providing more dynamic, even real-time insights into ESG performance. The paper reinforces the role of technologies like the Internet of Things, IoT, and the industrial internet, particularly in manufacturing and infrastructure sectors.
How will IoT help?
These can enable real-time data collection on things like energy consumption, emissions, water usage, even employee safety parameters directly from operational systems and sensors. This moves away from the old model of compiling data manually once a year towards continuous ESG dynamic tracking.
And AI and blockchain will play bigger roles as well.
Yes, definitely. AI is expected to play an increasing role in automating data cleaning, detecting anomalies or inconsistencies in reported data, and even predicting potential ESG risks based on patterns in the data. The paper notes that financial institutions and consulting firms are already exploring using AI to automatically check submitted ESG data against benchmarks or internal patterns to identify potential instances of selective disclosure or even data fabrication.
Using AI to spot greenwashing.
Potentially, yes. And blockchain technology, as we saw with the CARE4 example, is anticipated to become even more crucial for ensuring the credibility, transparency, and traceability of supply chain data, especially for sensitive products or in areas where ethical sourcing is paramount and hard to verify otherwise.
The scope of what's being reported is also expected to broaden significantly, right? Moving beyond just climate and the environment.
Absolutely. The paper identifies an expanding scope as a major future trend. While environmental topics like carbon emissions and energy efficiency have been prominent so far, the future will see a much greater emphasis on social and governance metrics.
What kind of social and governance metrics?
This includes areas like labor welfare and practices throughout the value chain, diversity and inclusion, D&I metrics, data privacy and security, which is a rapidly growing concern for obvious reasons, and crucial elements of corporate governance. Things like board structure diversity, transparency in executive compensation, ensuring robust accountability mechanisms are in place, and increasingly linking executive pay directly to achieving specific ESG key performance indicators, KPIs.
Why is this scope expanding now? What's driving it?
There's simply increasing demand from institutional investors, but also from employees, consumers, and the general public for greater transparency in these social and governance areas. There's also a growing expectation for companies to demonstrate their real, tangible contribution to the community and broader society, not just minimize harm.
And governance reporting will get more detailed.
The paper notes that the governance section within reports is likely to significantly expand, and importantly, it will require the same level of robust audit or independent assurance that's currently being pushed for environmental data to enhance its credibility. You can't just claim good governance, you'll need to prove it.
Ecosystem collaboration is another trend mentioned. How will companies work together differently on ESG?
The paper suggests that companies will increasingly collaborate through industry bodies and alliances. They'll work together to set baseline standards for their sector, develop common methodologies like carbon accounting within a specific industry, which is complex, and perhaps even conduct joint assessments or build shared reporting platforms.
Why collaborate instead of competing on ESG?
It helps reduce compliance costs for individual companies. It improves data consistency across a sector, making benchmarking easier, and it creates a unified voice when engaging with regulators or standard setters. Examples include ongoing efforts in international shipping or the steel industry to develop shared carbon accounting platforms and push for industry-wide audits or certifications.
And that finance sector linkage we discussed earlier, green bonds, SLLs, that will become even more pronounced.
Yes, the paper highlights the deepening linkage with the finance sector, the continued rapid expansion of green bonds, sustainable linked loans, SLLs, where interest rates are literally tied to achieving sustainability targets, and other sustainable finance products means that financial institutions are embedding ESG ratings and performance directly into their core lending and investment decisions.
Creating a strong financial incentive.
Exactly. It creates a very strong financial incentive for companies to not just disclose, but to actively improve their ESG performance. It also requires companies to provide their ESG information in a much more data-driven, standardized, and verifiable format. This facilitates the financial institution's ability to rapidly and quantitatively assess risks and track progress against sustainability commitments embedded in loan covenants or bond requirements.
Finally, the paper points to a significant shift in focus towards daily communication and risk preemption. What does that look like in practice?
This trend is being driven by that expectation of real-time information availability, especially via social media and online channels that we touched on earlier. The paper argues that comprehensive annual reports, while still necessary for detailed disclosure and assurance, can no longer fully satisfy the public's need for timely information in today's fast-paced world.
So companies need to communicate more often.
Yes. Companies need to adopt a multi-channel, continuous engagement strategy. The paper describes it as taking small steps, fast pace, to regularly release updates on their ESG progress and initiatives through their websites, social media feeds, newsletters, and other platforms. Keep the conversation going throughout the year.
And this continuous communication is particularly important during risk events like scandals or accidents.
Crucially, yes. The paper stresses that risk events, things like environmental incidents, spills, pollution, labor disputes, major product safety issues, or data leaks require swift and transparent disclosure, ideally within 24 hours. And this needs to be followed by continuous follow-up and tracking via all communication channels.
Managing the narrative proactively.
Right. The ability to respond quickly, transparently, and comprehensively during such events is absolutely vital for maintaining credibility and limiting potential damage to public trust and brand reputation. In this future landscape, ESG reports become just one part of a continuous, dynamic, and risk-aware communication process, rather than being just a static, retrospective annual summary document.
So looking ahead, the ESG disclosure landscape in 2025 and beyond seems like it will be characterized by an accelerating convergence of global standards, probably led by ISSB, significant integration of technology for real-time and verifiable data, a broadening scope to include a much wider range of social and governance metrics, increased collaboration across industry ecosystems, and definitely with the finance sector, and this fundamental shift towards continuous multi-channel communication that actively manages risk and builds trust in real time.
That paints a picture of a landscape that's not only more complex, but also much more dynamic and demanding for companies, doesn't it? It really requires strategic thinking, robust data management systems, broad stakeholder engagement, and a real willingness to embrace technology and seek credible external validation.
It certainly does. No more hiding.
Well, this deep dive has taken us on quite a journey. We've moved from the early fragmented approaches to ESG disclosure through the turning points like the Paris Agreement that spurred global convergence. We've explored the evolving strategic value of ESG beyond mere compliance, remembering it's about integration, not just reporting.
Hmm.
We delved into China's unique policy evolution and the distinct practices of its SOEs versus its private enterprises. We dissected the ongoing challenges companies still face with data and greenwashing. And you've given us a clear view of the exciting but also demanding future shaped by technology, expanding scope, and ever higher stakeholder expectations.
And the core message echoed throughout that CEIBS white paper is really clear, isn't it? True ESG value isn't just about the report itself. It's built on real, continuous internal action. The disclosure is the powerful engine that drives that continuous improvement,
Right.
and it facilitates this crucial common language for global dialogue, for value creation, and for accountability. It's a tool for transformation, not just another reporting requirement to tick off.
And effective ESG communication, as we've seen through all the detailed examples and strategies discussed today, requires not just collecting data, but strategic presentation, leveraging multiple channels for continuous engagement, embracing technology like AI and blockchain for accuracy and transparency, and critically seeking credible third-party validation to build that essential trust with stakeholders worldwide. It's really becoming an indispensable capability for companies operating in the modern global economy.
It is indeed table stakes, almost.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the 2025 ESG disclosure landscape, here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. It builds on these themes of global convergence alongside the unique paths taken by different regions like the US and China, with their differing philosophical underpinnings of shareholder value versus a broader social contract, and their distinct practical approaches to driving ESG forward. Given these persistent differences in underlying corporate philosophy, in regulatory drivers, and in implementation approaches across major economies, will the future of global ESG disclosure truly converge into a single, universally accepted model? Will we get that truly seamless language without borders? Or is it more likely we'll see a more hybrid future emerge?
A hybrid future.
Yeah, a future where different regional nuances, priorities, and philosophical underpinnings persist, requiring companies to become adept at navigating and communicating effectively across multiple, albeit increasingly compatible, ESG languages simultaneously. And if that's the case, what implications does that potential hybrid future have for your own role? Whether you're an investor evaluating companies across diverse markets, a manager trying to guide your company's strategy through this complex landscape, or simply an informed citizen seeking to understand the real impact of businesses in the world?
That's a great question to chew on. Will it be one language or many dialects?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.